go through several governments. William Pitt's government fell. Lord North proposes to bail out the company. And the way this is going to work is that all taxes on 17 million pounds of stockpiled tea from India would be lifted, so tax-free. This would drive down the price of tea and enable the company to sell it. So the British thought, hey, we're doing the Americans a favor. We're going to bring them duty-free tea from India and China and other parts of the East. This is good stuff. We're doing the Americans a big favor. But the Americans actually had the exact opposite reaction. They were not happy about getting access to the cheap tea. And as we're going to see, we already discussed this somewhat. They attributed sinister motives to the British. There was so much, by this time, so much cynicism and skepticism and even hostility to the British government that no matter what the British government did, Scott, I think the Americans were going to be anti that,
Yes.
Unless they just said, all right, no more taxes, period. We'll just leave you alone. But the British government was way beyond that point now. Okay, so the Americans had been buying tea from Dutch and other foreign merchants for very cheap prices, and they'd been smuggling it into America. Now these colonial merchants would be out of business. So with all this British tea coming over, this cheap British tea, that would reduce the need for smuggling tea in. So people like John Hancock, who made some of his money off of smuggling, were not happy about that. And another reason why the Americans were opposed to the Tea Act was they said lowering the price of tea is a trick. It will lure us into buying this cheap tea, and that will make us pay the Townsend tax on tea. This, in turn, would mean that we were acknowledging Parliament's right to tax them. So that's kind of a logical progression there, but it all comes down again to we don't believe Parliament has the right to tax us. They're like, no, we still don't. You're trying to trick us now. You're trying to get us to buy your tea. Then we'll still have to pay some tax, and then by paying that tax, we'll acknowledge the British right to tax us. So that's some of the reasons why they didn't want to do that. I always struggled with that for years, Scott. Why did they not want this tea? I mean, come on. But it makes sense when you think about it in economic terms, smugglers being put out of business and then having to acknowledge British tax policy. So in Philadelphia and New York, East India Company ships were just turned away. They would sail into the port and they'd see these men standing around with guns pointing their direction. And they would say, you know what? I think we'll turn around and go back. It's not worth that. But in Boston, of course, Boston. Boston people again. There they go again. Got to watch them every minute. Something totally different is going to happen in Boston. We'll talk about that in a minute. Do you have any thoughts or comments?
I have a historical anecdote about tea, but why don't you mention what happens in Boston first? And then
about tea? Oh, jolly good. I can't wait. Okay, so the Boston Tea Party comes along in 1773. That is Boston's reaction to the bringing of tea ships. And I do need to say that it was not called that at the time. It's not like, hey, guys, let's go have a tea party. That was a name given much later. That often happens in history, doesn't it, Scott? The people at the time call things one thing, or they just don't call it anything. And then later it's given a name. Everything has to have a name, right?
Mm-hmm.
So by now, Thomas Hutchinson, I had said earlier, he was the lieutenant governor, sometimes acting governor. He's now the full-fledged governor. Thomas Hutchinson orders that the tea ships be unloaded. He says what happened in Pennsylvania and New York is not going to happen here, or Philadelphia, New York. That tea is going to be unloaded or else. So a patriot organization called the Sons of Liberty, these are some of the most radical anti-British people, radical patriots. They get together on December 16th. Hey, that's my sister's birthday, but of course she wasn't born in 1773. Not quite that old. A couple years later, she was born, but she's not. I know she's not listening to this, so I can tease her. But anyway, so on that date, the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. And it wasn't a very convincing disguise. It wasn't like people said, oh my gosh, there's Indians, or who could these people be? But anyway, more importantly, they boarded the tea ships. They threw all the tea into the harbor. This was 90,000 pounds of tea, 90,000 pounds in terms of weight. It was worth 9,000 pounds sterling, which is a lot of money. That's nearly $2 million in today's U.S. dollars. And this was the first. So they turned Boston Harbor into the world's largest teacup.
I wonder what the dilution was. I'm sure there was some hydroanalysis research that somebody did to see what was the actual tea content. I can't imagine you could just dip your cup into Boston Harbor and it would taste the same. But
I can see Ben Franklin doing an experiment on that.
Yeah.
Oh, not bad. It's a little salty, but anyway. All right. So, and this is another watershed moment because this is the first time that colonists took direct destructive action against the British government. The first time they'd really destroyed British property, not just somebody's house or something, but British property, government property. And as I mentioned later, it became known as the Boston Tea Party. And King George was furious about this, as was Lord North. King George famously said, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph. We must not retreat." So we can see that both sides are getting increasingly unwilling to compromise. They're getting more and more hardline as we go along.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This also has an important symbolic meaning to the Americans as well. There's a letter from John Adams to Abigail Adams on July 6, 1774 that has to do with tea and coffee. And the meaning of this letter has been blown a little out of proportion, but I think there's something in here where he writes at the end of his letter to Abigail, "I believe I forgot to tell you one anecdote. When I first came to this house, it was late in the afternoon, and I had ridden 35 miles at least. 'Madam,' said I to Mrs. Huston, 'is it lawful for a weary traveler to refresh himself with a dish of tea, provided it has been honestly smuggled or paid no duties?' There you go. They don't like their duties. 'No, sir,' said she. 'We have renounced all tea in this place. I can't make tea, but he make you coffee. Accordingly, I have drank coffee every afternoon since,' and this is John Adams talking, 'and have borne it well. Tea must be universally renounced. I must be weaned, and the sooner the better.'" So some coffee aficionados believe this is the origin story of coffee and why Americans drink coffee and they don't drink tea in England. And I like the thought of this because I am a very aggressive coffee drinker. I lived in Turkey that drinks more tea per capita than anywhere else on planet Earth and resisted having tea replace coffee. I did an episode on this topic. Sadly, it has nothing to do with the symbology of the Boston Tea Party. It has more to do with the trade networks where America was simply more connected with the Caribbean islands where tea or coffee beans were harvested, and it just made more sense in global trade to drink coffee than it did for tea for Britain. But it's a nice idea. So all that to say that tea just it doesn't have the same taste that it used to in the American colonies.
Yeah, and it's interesting how a drink becomes a political statement, right, or a political thing. So drinking tea, somebody sees you drinking tea, oh, you're a Tory. A Tory, of course, is a loyalist or somebody loyal to the British government. And if you refuse to drink tea, you're supporting the Patriots. So it's very interesting. You're in some ways classified or buttonholed by the drink you choose.
Yeah. So I don't know. Fans of the Texans would drink their Shiner Bock, and fans of the Steelers would drink their Yingling. If that's a way to make it work. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
All right, so let's move on to what happens next. So the British government decides the gloves are coming off. Okay, no more Mr. Nice Guy. We are going to force these colonies, as King George said, they must submit or triumph, and triumph is not an option. So here's what they do. They pass a series of laws, and they're really 4 or 5 different individual laws, but I'm going to lump them together for simplicity's sake, called the Coercive Acts, passed the year after the Boston Tea Party in 1774. The Americans called them the Intolerable Acts because they saw them as intolerable. That's pretty straightforward. So one law closed the port of Boston until compensation was paid, and so in other words, if you don't pay us back for that tea, no ships are going in, no ships are going out. So they're hitting the Boston merchants in their wallets. And they also replaced the civil government with martial law. So no more civilian governor, Thomas Hutchinson. He gets recalled. He goes to England, and he's replaced by a military governor named General Thomas Gage. We'll talk a little bit more about General Gage in a minute. General Gage is going to be the military governor of Massachusetts, as well as the commander of all British forces in the colonies, the supreme commander, for a while anyway. They also, so I think the first one's called the Boston Port Act, and the second one is the Government Act. I may be a little bit wrong on these titles. I haven't actually studied this particular issue in a little while. The third law allowed the governor of Massachusetts to quarter troops in unoccupied buildings, and that's the Quartering Act. And that's where we get the Third Amendment from in the Constitution. We'll talk about that another time. But now some sources say that the governor, that troops could be quartered in private homes, and others say not private homes. So let's say, Scott, you had a home, but you also had like a barn. Well, the soldiers might be put up in the barn, or you had some other type of building, a warehouse or something like that. Again, sources seem to be divided, but most of the ones I've read said not in private homes. I don't know have you ever seen, Scott, the Netflix series? It's not originally Netflix, but it's on Netflix as of today, at least. There's a series called Turn: Washington Spies. I have not. No. Oh, Scott, you're killing me, man. You've got to watch that. I know you're a busy man, but it's terrific. Now, it is historical fiction. They take a lot of liberties, but it's about the Culper Ring, which we will talk about in a future episode. But they show, for example, a British major that's living in the home of some Americans there. And of course, they were loyalists, at least technically. So I don't know. But you do see some shows where you see British soldiers moving into homes and taking over homes. And that did happen occasionally, but that wasn't because of this law. Right. So if you wonder why the Third Amendment is there, it's because of this. And there was a wonderful article in The Onion a few years ago about a Third Amendment rights group in America that goes around and they said, we saw two sailors and we thought they were forcing quarter on people. And then we realized they were brothers that were just going home. So that is funny. Yeah, it's funny. I talk to my students and we talk about the amendments, and I'll say the First Amendment. How many of you have heard of this? Every hand goes up. Second Amendment, every hand goes up, especially in Texas. Third Amendment, nobody. I mean, maybe they've heard of it, but it's not a burning issue. But we see where it comes from. And at the same time, a group of Massachusetts residents in Suffolk County, which is to the west of Boston, they drafted a set of radical resolves attacking the intolerable acts, and they sent them to the other colonies. Again, here we see the ideas of Massachusetts are being broadcast to other colonies as well. And even though we're talking about Massachusetts and Boston in particular, there's a lot of anti-British government sentiment springing up in other places as well, especially Virginia. But we're focusing for now, just for simplicity's sake, on Boston. Other colonies were not so angry at Britain, but again, more on that later. So these acts, these radical resolves. They're called the Suffolk Resolves, of course, after Suffolk County. They're not really good at naming things. They just name them after whatever, but it makes sense at least. All right, so I talked about Virginia. Virginia read these, and they said, yeah, that's right. In May 1774, the Virginia burgesses declared that the acts are, quote, an attack, in other words, the intolerable acts, are, quote, an attack on all British America and threatens ruin to the rights of all. So, yeah, it wasn't just Boston merchants that were getting hurt by some of the British economic policies. Some of the planters in the South were also being hurt. Washington complained a lot about British taxes and tariffs and things like that. So the anti-government movement is spreading. It's spreading to other colonies, not just Massachusetts. Do you have any sense on the level of taxation that a colonist would be having for a subject in Britain itself on the mainland? Would it be much more, much less? Do you have any sense of that, James? Oh, the American colonies were taxed way less than the British citizens in Great Britain itself. I mean, the amount of tax compared to the British at the time, and certainly compared to us today. Oh my goodness. I mean, this is nothing. This is an argument that British make sometimes. You guys are the least taxed people in the world. We asked you to just give a little more, and you take up arms against us. USA. Yeah, no kidding, right? Yeah. Well, we've never liked taxes, have we? Well, some Americans seem to these days, but most Americans do not like taxes.
There you go. A little bit of economic history.
Yeah. So,